we were strongly opposed, myself and my party were strongly opposed to violence and to the IRA in particular, because we argued that when we were a divided people, that violence could not heal the divisions, it only deepened the divisions and made the problem worse. And of course, always violence from one side always led to violence from the other as well. And you had the doctrine of an eye for an eye, which, as Mahatma Gandhi did say, leaves everybody blind. So we strongly opposed violence throughout. And what we did was present our analysis of the problem, saying that the people of Northern Ireland were divided, but they were divided about three sets of relationships. They were divided about the relationships within Northern Ireland, they were divided about the relationships within Ireland, and they were divided about the relationships with Britain. And that for the problem to be solved, that those three sets of relationships should be the agenda at any talks. And given that that should be the agenda, then the British and Irish governments should be together at the table with all the parties. And of course that was our strategy from the beginning. And that eventually was achieved in 1998 when we all got round the table and got that agreement. But in those days as well, you see, the British government would not talk to the Irish government about Northern Ireland because its policy was very simple, that Northern Ireland was an integral part of the United Kingdom, full stop, and therefore it was none of the business of the Irish government, ignoring the real problem, which was the conflict of two identities, the Britishness of the Unionist people and the Irishness of the Catholic people, the nationalist people. The IRA and Sinn Féin, what was called the Republican movement, were engaged in violence in order to attempt to solve our problem, and I was strongly opposed to that violence. And of course, there was violence as well from the Unionist side, the Loyalist paramilitaries, and of course, I felt it's everyone's duty to do everything they could to get the violence stopped. And of course, thousands of British soldiers in our streets couldn't stop the violence. And when I started my dialogue, I was very heavily attacked for it. But as I made clear at the time, if thousands of soldiers on our streets can't stop the violence, if I can save one single human life by talking, it's my duty to do so. And I engaged directly in dialogue with Gerry Adams. And of course, the dialogue arose out of the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985. In my party, we were very heavily involved in the creation of that agreement. We published a policy document in April 1981. And if you read that policy document, you're reading the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985. We argued strongly that given the three sets of relationships, that the British and Irish governments should come together and set up institutions. And those institutions were set up in the Anglo-Irish Agreement. The basic policy of the British government was that since the majority of people in Northern Ireland wished to remain in the United Kingdom, that was that. We asked what would happen if a majority wanted something else, if a majority wanted to say Irish unity. And the British government then agreed to say, well, if that happens, we'll legislate for it. That removed the fundamental reasons that the IRA had always given for the use of violence. And the historian in me knew what created the IRA and that movement, and that they believed that since they believed that Britain was in Ireland defending her own interests, therefore the Irish had the right to use violence to put them out. And my argument was that that type of thinking was out of date. And when Britain declared that if a majority wanted Irish unity, I then come out with a statement and said Britain has now declared their neutrality on the future of Ireland, and therefore violence has absolutely no role to play. And by keeping up that statement, I eventually got a message back that the Sinn Féin people would like to talk to me about it, and I engaged in the talks with Gerry Adams, and the basic request to me was to prove what I was saying was true, and that led me to privately, and I kept both the British and Irish governments fully informed of my dialogue with Gerry Adams, and that in the end I asked them to prove what I was saying was true, which led to the Downing Street Declaration, which made very clear that the British had no selfish economic or strategic interests in remaining in Ireland, and that if the people agreed on Irish unity, they would legislate for it. And that, of course, led straight away to the ceasefires and led also to the dialogue with all parties and the two governments around the one table.
The reason why they went for me was because my pitch to the council was that I was going to change the way we did things. That I was, instead of the defensive mindset that unfortunately had dominated unionism up until then, that I would make a serious effort to achieve things, and that and in doing that, I would be prepared to go and meet people and talk to people that in the past we hadn't talked to. In the first instance, that actually meant John Hume, who was my first point of call. And it also meant going to Dublin and speaking to the Irish Prime Minister, which again, we had not done. Gerry Adams was down was at the end of that trail, not the beginning, because in 1995, we had a situation where we were not engaged in any, at that stage, not engaged in a serious direct discussion with Irish nationalism or with the Irish government. Now, that in doing that and talking to these people, I was not changing our political stance one iota. We are still a unionist party that is there for the union of the United Kingdom and very firmly dedicated to that. What I was doing was changing the approach on things and indeed trying to get a political agreement which would create and provide for stability, political stability in Northern Ireland. Now, from 95 to 98, we did actually achieve that.
And of course, in coming to that agreement, my party had a clear philosophy throughout as well, that there should be, in Northern Ireland, we should have institutions that respected the differences of the people and that gave no victory to either side. In other words, we always argued for partnership government, or power sharing as it was called, that the representatives of all sections of the community should be in government, and that there should be a council of ministers between Ireland North and South. That was our strategy as well. And at the agreement talks, we argued strongly for that, and that was eventually agreed. And of course, I always say that in my approach to that agreement, I was very heavily inspired by my European experience, because I was a member of the European Parliament. European Union is the best example in the history of the world of conflict resolution. Therefore, it's the duty of every area of conflict to study how they did it. And that's what we did. And of course, the three principles at the heart of that are the three principles at the heart of our Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. Principle number one, respect for difference. No victory for either side. Number two, institutions which respect our differences. An assembly elected by a proportional system of voting so that all sections of our people are represented. And an executive government elected by the assembly by a proportional system so that all sections are in government. And then the third principle, which in my opinion is the most important principle, which I call the healing process. We then work together, all sections of our people working together in our common interests, which is the principle that when our party was founded way back in the early 70s was central to it, common interest being real politics, economic development of our people, something which is an area of agreement for all sections of the people. And now we are doing that, working together. That's the beginning of the healing process, as I say. We're spilling our sweat together now, not our blood. And my belief is that as we do that over the years, the barriers of the past, the distrust and prejudices of the past will be eroded, and a new society will evolve, a new Ireland, based in agreement and respect for difference, in which Catholic, Protestant and dissenter will be living together in agreement and in mutual respect. And that's the strategy that myself and my party have pursued and are pursuing.
One does have to point to the fact that we did achieve an agreement, that we had that agreement endorsed by a majority of the people of Northern Ireland, that despite very considerable political difficulties since then, we've actually managed to implement the greater part of the political agenda of that agreement, and we have restored local parliamentary institutions in Northern Ireland, that we have a local administration in place which is working, maybe not working ideally, but is still actually there. Those are the significant political developments that one's had a hand in. And obviously one point to that has been the things that one looks back at with most satisfaction, but I realise that it's still work in progress.
I always tell the story of the first time I went to Strasbourg in 1979 to the European Parliament. I went for a walk across the bridge from Strasbourg in France to Kiel in Germany, and I stopped in the middle of the bridge and meditated, 1979, that if I had stood in this bridge 30 years ago, I thought, at the end of the Second World War, and at the end of the first half of that century, which was the worst in the history of the world, 2 world wars, and about 100 million people slaughtered. Who could have dreamt then that in the second half of that century, those same peoples would unite in a European Union? But they did. I grew up in Derry, of course, and Derry was the worst example of Northern Ireland's discrimination. Of course, the Unionist people wishing to protect their heritage and their identity, and they have every right to do that, in my opinion, because every society has diversity, and respect for diversity is central and essential. But my quarrel with their approach was, of course, their methodology. I called it their Afrikaner mindset. They held all power in their own hands in order to protect themselves, in order to ensure that the minority in Northern Ireland, which was a Catholic population, never became a majority. And that meant widespread discrimination in housing, in jobs, and in voting rights. And of course, the worst example of that was the city of Derry, where I lived. 70% of the population of Derry was from the Catholic community, largely nationalist people who wanted Irish unity. And of course, 30% were the Protestant community who were Unionists, but they governed the city. And their system was known as gerrymander. They divided the city into 3 electoral wards. And in one ward, there was 70% of the people, the Catholic population, and they elected 8 representatives to the city council. And there was 2 other districts which represented 30% of the population, and each of those districts elected 6 members, so the Unionists always had 12-8. They were in charge of public housing, the local council, and they deliberately located people in a ghetto situation in order to ensure that they maintained control. Well, of course, this meant that there was discrimination not only in housing but in jobs, and my father was unemployed, and of course he was a very, very intelligent man and well known as that, because when I was a child growing up in our home, I would be sitting at the table doing my homework, and my father would be sitting at the table, and people would be coming in from the district and around the city for him to write their letters, because he was a copperplate handwriter, and he also knew the whole system inside out. So that we suffered a lot from discrimination, but what happened, I was lucky in the sense that a new education system was introduced. It was introduced in Britain in 1944, but then eventually in Northern Ireland in 1947. And in the first year of that, I passed the examination and got a scholarship to go to secondary school. And of course, that otherwise I would never have been educated.
Well, I'm a Presbyterian, and I grew up within that ambit. And the town of Bangor in Northern Ireland was predominantly Presbyterian. And in Northern Ireland, Presbyterianism is associated with people of Scots background, Scots origin. And several centuries ago, 350 years ago, my ancestors came from Scotland to Northern Ireland. Now, there's been obviously over 300 years a fair degree of intermarriage and mixing and all the rest of it, but you can still say in Northern Ireland, if you look, that Presbyterianism is an indication of a background which is, and a culture which is Scots. Being what you would call an Episcopalian is an indication of a background that would be predominantly English. I was interested in politics. And would have taken a fair amount of interest in it, although my interest would have been in national politics rather than regional Northern Ireland politics. And I remember, for example, staying up during the 1959 general election, which was won, of course, by Harold Macmillan, listening to the results. And now I would have been 14 at the time, and it would have been, in that sense, most of my peers at school, people the same age as myself, wouldn't have had the same interest in politics as myself, but I always was interested in politics. It was a biography of King John, written by the chap who at that time was the main professor of history at Queen's University. The thing that I liked about the book was that it didn't follow the sort of traditional bad King John approach. It actually dealt with the times of John. And of course, people remember John in terms of Magna Carta and all the rest of it. But it was quite interesting to me to discover that John, when he was Lord of Ireland, had come right up to the other side of Belfast Lough and had actually assaulted and carried Carrickfergus Castle after a 4-day siege and assault. Which was quite remarkable because the castle, the Carrickfergus Castle, which is still intact, it was quite a considerable fortification. It was the seat of the Norman barons of Ulster, and that the Earl of Ulster at that time had been in revolt against King John, and he was actually noted for these lightning military moves, and extremely successful ones. Now, mind you, he came unstuck a number of other times as well. But what I liked about that book is it actually challenged the received view in terms of the review that we had received, that one found in the, as it were, the school text, history texts. And that I find interesting. And again, of course, one finds out again and again in life that the received wisdom is sometimes, very often right, but at the same time, you can have situations where a view develops about a particular person. And then you find when you look a bit more closely that the reality is otherwise. Of course, it was Louis Warren, W.L. Warren, and this obviously was his period. King John was his first book, and then he wrote another very good book on Henry II and many other books as well. And I had the pleasure actually eventually of meeting him and getting to know him quite well when I joined the staff at Queen's University. Well, Bangor was a town, and North Down is an area which has not, in fact, been directly affected by the Troubles to any great extent. There have been effects, but not greatly. And the what we call the Troubles in Northern Ireland have been actually quite localised in their impact, in the sense that there are particular localities that have suffered very badly. North Belfast, for example, which has had very bad impact, in terms of the number of fatalities that have occurred. Although in terms of number of fatalities per population, the worst affected areas have been in West Tyrone, particularly around the small village of Castlederg. So you've got particular localities like that which have been badly affected. The disturbance to the political situation generally, yes, that has been a problem. And one thing that particularly influenced me was that a lot of the initial difficulties arose around the city of Londonderry. And a number of claims, political claims were made about the city of Londonderry, and particularly the local council. Now, it just so happened that a relative of mine had been in the late 50s mayor in Londonderry. And when I heard people talk about, late 50s, early 60s, heard people talk about what the local authority was alleged to have done in Londonderry. And I said, well, now, that can't have been Jack, because I knew Jack to be a person of irreproachable character. And I said, what I'm hearing can't be right. And that, if you like, ties up with my attitude to the history of John III. What I'm hearing can't be right. And when I looked more closely at the circumstance, I thought it wasn't entirely right. And in fact, with regard to him personally, not right at all. But with regard to the situation, not a fair account. And that engaged me at that sense. In terms of the violence of the Troubles, no, I can't say that affected me directly, although like everybody in Northern Ireland, I have had friends who have been murdered. I've had close friends who have been murdered. Although those came at a later stage, that's in the mid-1970s after the Troubles had been underway for some time. Before that happened, I had that experience.
My father was unemployed, and I was the eldest of 7 children. We were very poor, and when you ask how do we support ourselves, the only funding that we had was, of course, unemployment payment. And in that sense, my mother used to, because in the city of that time, of course, most men were unemployed. And the women worked because the city was the centre of the shirt industry. And but my mother used to work at home at night. She didn't work during the day because she was rearing 7 children, but at night time she would do some outside work for the shirt factories. We grew up, but we were poor. I mean, when I was at school, one of the things I did, I delivered newspapers at night. to earn some money as well, around the district. But that was a very common situation in the Derry of those days, and most Catholics grew up in that way. But in my opinion, what changed the situation eventually, and of course it took a lot of time to change it, things like that don't change in a week or a fortnight, was the new educational system, which meant that for the first time, our population, particularly, because up to then, if you were from a poor background, you couldn't go to higher education because your parents couldn't afford it. And I got a scholarship to go to secondary school, and then at the end of my secondary school period, I got a scholarship to go to university.
Oh, my father was a civil servant, fairly sort of middle ranking, low to middle ranking. He worked almost entirely in what was then called the Ministry of Labour, dealing with employment, unemployment issues. And I remember when I was very young being taken to Belfast to what was commonly called the Brew. It was the Labour Exchange in Corporation Street, the main one in Belfast, where Father worked. And then latterly he worked on the programmes in Northern Ireland to encourage investment in Northern Ireland. I remember one project that he worked on in a fairly minor way, but was very pleased to be associated with, was the very large development just outside Londonderry, which resulted in a major US firm coming, where in order to get that firm to come, the Northern Ireland government had to build a power station and also a power station at Colquhoun, and then also provide as it were, its own docking arrangements. A major jetty was built and all the rest of it, and that was just simply to get a very large US textile firm to come to the United States. I mean, people were so keen to get investment. In those days, there was quite significant unemployment in Northern Ireland as a whole, and that, of course, had been the general pattern in Northern Ireland for many, many years. I went to the local schools, the local primary school, local state primary school, and then to the local, what was called a grammar school, which was a secondary school, which technically was an independent school. But it was not part of the state educational system, but it was. I went to it simply because it was the nearest school. My primary sporting achievement at school was that I dodged games for 2 complete years, and was well through the 3rd year before they discovered that I had completely avoided all games. So that is, I think, is my greatest achievement at school. One of the achievements I have at school that I look back on with particular pride. The school's playing pitches were physically remote from the school. They weren't actually on the same side as the school. And so by virtue of not turning up on the first day, and I suppose en route from the school to the playing pitches, there was the library, and I sort of dropped off in the library and spent my time. That's, by the library I mean the Carnegie Library in Vanguard, which served the town as a whole. I would spend my time in the library rather than, and as I say, they didn't get on the master's role, the sports master's role, so he didn't notice my absence. Every child growing up will look to their parents, mother and my father. My grandmother lived with us. I picked up quite a bit of family lore and history from her, which again was interesting. Those are obviously big influences. Like every individual is influenced primarily by home, and then you look to the wider community that you're growing up within: church, local community, school. I mean, these are the influences that everybody has. Some individuals might stand out because of one thing or another, but whether one's perception as a child of what was important or not is accurate, I don't know.
When I come home from university, of course, I felt that I had a duty to help those that weren't as lucky as I was. And the first thing I did was I wasn't getting involved in politics, because the politics of those days was what was basically flag waving, and I felt that I'd always felt politics should be about the living standards of people. But when I came home, I wasn't interested in politics in those days, but I was interested in helping people. And I got involved in the foundation of the credit union movement. And of all the things I've been doing, it's the thing I'm proudest of, because no movement has done more good for the people of Ireland, North and South, than the credit union movement. Before the arrival of the credit union, people who were from a poor background or a working class background, who couldn't borrow from banks. Banks wouldn't have them. When they needed to borrow money for rearing their children and for furniture, etc., for normal things, then the methodology in those days was either from loan sharks or from pawn shops. And of course, that meant that people were made poor by all of that, particularly by the charge of loan sharks. So what the credit union movement did, of course, was not only help the ordinary people to have the true value of whatever their income was, but it helped local businesses, small business as well, because the money that would have left your city in loan charges remained and were spent, and therefore, I mean, when we started the credit union in those early days, the first few meetings was few people joined, but very soon it spread rapidly. And today that credit union, which I was involved in starting in 1960, has 22,000 members and has something over £40 million in savings of the people. And of course, all over Ireland today, there's 2.2 million members in credit union in a population of 5 million. And I'm very proud that I was president of the Credit Union League of Ireland, of the whole of Ireland, when I was 27 years old. I never thought in terms of being a leader. I thought very simply in terms of helping people. Having grown up as I grew up, I felt that anything I could do to help people, I should do it. And in other words, putting into practice normal attitudes to life. And I think most human beings would help other people if they were able to do so. When I was involved in credit union, I decided to do the same in housing, because housing discrimination was very widespread in our city, and many families, there was most houses in working class districts, you had several families living together in the one house, and it was very difficult to get a house. So because the politicians who controlled housing were doing so in a very discriminatory factor. What I got involved in was founding a housing association to build our own houses in the same manner as the credit union. But in the first year or so, we housed about 100 families. Then I put in a plan to build 700 houses, and the local politicians wouldn't give us planning permission because it would upset the voting balance in their gerrymandered system. And that led me straight into politics. It led me straight into the civil rights movement. And of course, in the 1960s, civil rights was very much in the international news because of the leadership of Martin Luther King in the United States. And that had a very major influence on people like myself. And we got involved in the civil rights movement, seeking equality of treatment for all sections of our people. And of course, my involvement in the civil rights movement led me straight into politics. In Northern Ireland, it was about the civil rights movement was about discrimination and about equality of treatment. It was about, and the civil rights movement in the United States was about the same thing, about equality of treatment for all sections of the people. And that's precisely what our movement was about as well. And the slogans that we had was one man, one vote. Today we would say one person, one vote. Fair allocation of housing and fair allocation of jobs. And those were the three areas of discrimination. For example, in voting in those days, for example, in local government level where all the discrimination took place, the only people who had votes were people who paid rates. So if you grew up in your family, your mother and father would have votes because they paid the rent and rates, but you would have none, no vote. And of course, also in those days, a limited company would have 6 votes. And I remember a mayor of our city had 43 votes because he owned 7 limited companies, which is 42 votes plus his own. So that was the civil rights that we were seeking: one person, one vote, fair allocation of housing and fair allocation of jobs, ordinary common sense and ordinary decency for our society. And that was our civil rights movement.
There was a considerable political upheaval in the early 70s when the Troubles began, and the established unionist political leadership seemed to have difficulty in responding to it. And a number of parties came into existence. Dr. Paisley's Democratic Unionist Party came into existence. Other groupings came. Vanguard was originally a ginger group within the mainstream Unionist Party, then evolved into a political party. What I found attractive about it is, unlike the others, it had a coherent response to the situation. And it seemed to me that it was doing some serious thinking about it. And I joined Vanguard and was elected as a Vanguard representative to the Constitutional Convention in 1975. Unfortunately, although we came very close in 1975 to producing an agreement that would have resolved the situation, and indeed it was my own grouping, Vanguard, and particularly Bill Craig, with whom I was associated at that time, who took the initiative in bringing forward those proposals, which, as I say, came very close to producing an agreement. That did not eventuate, and that actually politically destroyed Vanguard as an operation. The controversy over Bill Craig's proposed coalition with the SDLP in 1975 led to basically the first a split and then a collapse in Vanguard. And Vanguard at that stage was part of a coalition that embodied the other main unionist elements too. And I had the experience then in 1970, early 1976, of being expelled and found myself in the political wilderness, politically for the 10 years that followed that. But I remembered the particular experience in the early 70s, how close we came to agreement, the areas where we had failed, and thought a lot about it over the time. And it did mean that when political opportunities came for me later in the 1990s, that I'd had the experience of going through a major political upheaval and crisis comparable to that we experienced then in the late 90s. Well, I think for a person who's involved in politics, politics is not a situation where you have a stable career. Anybody who thinks in politics that they're going to have a career that builds in the way that a career in the civil service or in academia or even perhaps in business, think that's going to happen is wrong. Politics is very much a game of snakes and ladders, and I don't think any politician can really regard themselves as being experienced and fully developed if they haven't experienced failure. And I think failure is actually quite important in that sense. I think that particularly in politics, but maybe in other aspects of life as well, encountering failure is important because it reminds you about some basic elements about life, and seeing how other people react to you when you've had a failure is also quite educative.
We sought equality of treatment and civil rights, and of course that was refused, and the civil rights movement was totally, as it was in the United States, totally non-violent and totally committed to non-violence. But quite often their marches would not be allowed by the government of the day in Northern Ireland, and the marches would be stopped in the streets by the police of those days. And that, of course, created a lot of tension in the community as well. But as I say, the philosophy of the civil rights movement was certainly a strong philosophy of my own. I was very heavily inspired by people like Martin Luther King and by Mahatma Gandhi, and I quoted them quite a lot. In fact, even my political party to this day, we always sing "We Shall Overcome." But as I say, when I then got into politics, I stood for election, and in that election I sought a mandate to found a new political party based on social democratic philosophy. In other words, that we would deal with real politics, with housing, with jobs, with voting rights, and not into flag-waving politics, because in my belief that was a common ground, and if you work common ground together, that would end the divisions in our society. First of all, if you had equality of treatment, and then you started working in matters that affects all sections of the community. But of course, given the nature of our politics, it was very difficult to break down those barriers, because the governing body insisted on standing by the old style approach, and it's been a hard, long road. But as I say, our philosophy as a party, because the violence, of course, had broken out on both sides as well, our philosophy of a party was very, very clear. that it was our people that were that there was two mentalities, and both mentalities had to change. There was what I called the Afrikaner mindset of the Unionist politicians, which was holding all power in their own hands and discriminating, and their objective was to protect their identity. We agreed that they had every right to protect their identity, but that their methodology should change, because when you have widespread discrimination against a community, as we had in Northern Ireland, in the end it's bound to lead to conflict. And our challenge to the change of the Unionist mindset was that given their objective of protecting their identity, which we have no quarrel with, that given their geography and their numbers, the problem couldn't be solved without them. Therefore, they should come to a table and reach an agreement that would protect their identity. Then in my own community, of course, what is called the nationalist community, there was a mindset, not a majority mindset, but one that based on that Ireland is based on violence, and of course that mindset I described as a territorial mindset. Ireland is our land, and you Unionists, Protestants, are a minority, therefore you can't stop us uniting. Now our challenge to that mindset, my challenge to that mindset was that it's people that have rights, not territory. Without people, even Ireland is only a jungle. And when people are divided, victories are not solutions.
It was the mainstream Unionist Party. And in the problems that developed in the early 1970s, there was a certain degree of confusion, and other parties developed, as did Vanguard. But Vanguard grew out of the Ulster Unionist Party, and many people, when Vanguard then ran into difficulties, the natural thing was to move back into the mainstream and work within that. And it was the only viable political option in the late 1970s. The Ulster Unionist Party in the late 1970s into the 1980s was engaged in a very considerable internal debate about what the nature of its policies should be. I engaged in that debate. I wasn't entirely comfortable with the line that the leadership took in the 1980s, but nevertheless persisted and took part in the internal debate that was there. But it was really only with the beginning of a talks process in 1991 that the opportunity came to change things. And by then, I had found myself, a little bit to my surprise, a member of Parliament and returned as one of the party's 9 members of Parliament at Westminster. And so when the opportunity came in 1991 with the beginning of a talks process, I was then finally in a position again to make some contribution politically. The opportunity came by surprise. I found myself in a position of being the chairman of a constituency association. In fact, actually the party leaders' constituency association, and there was always in my mind the possibility that at some point he would be standing down and there would be perhaps the opportunity of seeking the nomination in his seat. And then, tragically, the Member of Parliament of the neighbouring constituency, he died in his early 50s from cancer, quite unexpectedly. And so consequently an opportunity arose then. And as I say, somewhat to my surprise, I was selected as to contest that, and delighted to get the opportunity to do so. I mean, when the chance came to move back into the front line of politics, I had no hesitation in doing so. I was grateful for the opportunity to make a difference. The difficulties arose in Northern Ireland. The political violence really starts 1970, 1971. And there's a degree of, the violence starts 1970-71. The political difficulties start a little bit beyond that. In the mid-70s, certainly the time of the Constitutional Convention, 74-75, many people would have said in Northern Ireland that it's obvious what the outcome is going to be. You could get on the back of an envelope, you could sketch on the back of an envelope in general terms what the outcome was going to be. The detail would have to be negotiated. You would also have to have the right opportunity to bring this about. You need to have the right combination of personalities. We nearly did it in 75. Unfortunately, it took another 20 years before we had the right combination of circumstances and personalities. But it's important to bear in mind that difficult as the situation was, it was actually, to use someone else's phrase, a low-intensity situation in terms of, yes, there was political violence, yes, there were fatalities, but the fatalities were actually lower than the fatalities that would have happened in any comparable city in the United States at any one time during that whole time. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Northern Ireland actually had a lower crime level than any comparable industrial area. It had political violence, but that was happening at a level where there wasn't the same high level of intensity, and so consequently, you might say there wasn't quite the same pressure on society to make the compromises that were necessary. A lot of people were comfortable with the situation that existed, and that is part of the reason why it lasted so long. So yes, in the 1990s, there was a difficult situation. My main frustration was the fact that knowing that political progress was possible, we were yet not been able to achieve that which I knew to be possible because of various difficulties, some personal, some of a political nature. So it took a long period of time before the chance that had been there in the 1970s recurred. And even then, it took a talks process that lasted with interruptions from 1991 to 1998 to produce an agreement. And now we're 4 years after the agreement, more than 4 years after the agreement, and we still haven't actually changed an awful lot in some respects. So the talks took an awful long time. The implementation post-agreement is taking a long time. And that is one of the frustrations about this, that it has taken so long to reach the point of having the political breakthrough. But even after that, we are still struggling in terms of the implementation of the agreement. So the main frustration comes from this slowness. And yet I suppose when the historians come to look at it, they might actually find that the slow pace has had some benefits too in enabling people to adjust and to change attitudes. But from one's point of view of being directly in conjunction with events, the slowness has been a bit frustrating too. We've had some small progress on that issue, but the actual problem itself has not been resolved. The whole object of the agreement, if you put it very simply, the agreement is there to try and produce peace and democracy in Northern Ireland. Right? And we've got a lot of progress in terms of building democratic institutions and people working together in it. An awful lot has happened there. And in terms of peace, yes, we have a much lower level of violence and people have got a qualitative change in how their lives are conducted. But we haven't got an absence of violence. And we haven't got rid of the private armies. You can't say that you've got a society that's operating by purely peaceful and democratic means if you still have within that society various private armies which have political ambitions maintained in existence and continuing every now and again to flex their muscles. Now, that is the problem. That is the problem. And until we can get that problem resolved, then we can't be confident that, for example, with regard to the Irish Republican movement, that its movement into politics has been genuine and not tactical. While it's involved in politics, that's fine, but while it still retains a private army, then you cannot be sure that its conversion to peace and democracy is genuine and is permanent. If it retains the option of going back to violence, you can't really regard it as a normal political or organisation. And the same is true with regard to the other private armies that exist and the people that operate and control them. That while they retain the option of a resort to violence, then you can't regard them as peace-loving Democrats. And that problem of the continuation of armed gangs with political objectives remains. There's possible that what you're saying is part of a process of change, but if that is so, then obviously we want to see the progress taking place, demonstrably taking place, and the goal getting closer. And that's part of the frustration when things have been moving so slowly and, as I say, over 4 years after the agreement. And some of the issues that the agreement on paper settled, we haven't actually got them settled on the streets. And that is quite frustrating. And of course, it tends to drain away support from the process. The business of parading is quite common in Northern Ireland, as indeed as it is in the United States as well. And there are shared cultural reasons for that. And for those of the unionist community, the main parades and organisation that they would look at would be those which are orange, that relate back to the Glorious Revolution at the end of the 17th century. And those have been happening in Ireland from the 18th century onwards. Yes, they represent a particular communal view, but they are essentially two people within the Unionist community. They're more in terms of a festival or a celebration. Now, in the United States, you have the arrangement with regard to popular parades and all the rest of it, that people have the freedom of assembly and the right to process. And you would not allow, and you would not dream of allowing groups by the threat of violence to inhibit the exercise of that right. And indeed, there have been a number of notable instances in the United States where the authorities have gone to considerable lengths to ensure that even people that you don't like have the right to process. It's in your constitution. Now, it's always been in our sense of liberty as well, but in the United Kingdom we do not have a written constitution in the same way. And in a situation where those things which were popularly regarded as rights are actually dependent on ordinary law and custom and practice, then the situation can evolve differently. And what has happened in Northern Ireland is that we've got efforts being made to ghettoise society, for people to carve out ghettos and say, this is our territory, nobody else is allowed to come into it. And those ghettos which carved out haven't remained static. They've, in some places, they've expanded. And what then happened with regard to the Drumcree incident is that a traditional parade, which had been following the same route since 1807, became controversial because part of the territory over which the parade was taking place changed colour, and what had been an orange road became a green road. And then people living adjacent to that road said that they were going to prevent the parade from taking place. What had been a Protestant area had become Catholic, and that's the adjacent territory. What you were actually dealing with was with the main road, and there was no question of people parading through the streets of a housing district, but actually coming down the main road, and the adjacent housing projects alongside the road had changed colour, and the people there were saying, we will stop this. And so you had that clash between one view of liberty, which was one not very dissimilar from the view that you would take in the United States, and those who were trying to carve out areas which they could then dominate and control. Now, the latter development is actually part of a bigger problem that's happening in Northern Ireland, in that over the years of the Troubles, the areas which have become sort of recognised, that is a green area that's controlled entirely by Republican paramilitaries. This is an orange area, it's controlled by loyalist paramilitaries. This is a thoroughly bad situation because it diminishes the areas where there is any degree of common freedom, and it diminishes the areas where the normal laws of society apply. Because although the authorities are supposed to govern everywhere and the police are supposed to move in areas which are recognised as being dominated by loyalist paramilitaries or Republican paramilitaries, then the normal rules don't apply. And that is a thoroughly bad development. And we've had those problems. It's the same problems we're having with the violence that's taken place in Belfast over the last few weeks. Again, it is on what we call interfaces. In other words, on the boundary line between a Republican ghetto and a loyalist ghetto. And there's fighting going on, and those boundary lines are not necessarily static. People are trying to expand their territory one way or the other, and has produced in Belfast in the last few weeks some very serious riots. It is that general problem. Parades are a symptom, but they're the symptom that the parade in itself is not a problem. What is a problem is the ghettoisation of society that has taken place. And we need to find some way of actually arresting that and changing the context in which it operates. The agreement is supposed to do that, because the agreement tries to set out a set of principles and standards that are applicable to all, to move to a rights-based society and rights-based approach. But we're a long way from implementing all those matters. Yes, we've got the European Convention on Human Rights embodied in domestic law, and we have other structures that are there. But in terms of what happens on the street, I'm afraid it's the older business of one gang fighting against another gang, one paramilitary group fighting another paramilitary group, the UDA fighting the IRA. That is what is happening on the streets, rather than the rights-based civil society that the agreement envisaged applying throughout society as a whole.
The subjects that I specialised in eventually when I got to university and got my degree in were French and history, so that I became a very fluent speaker of another people's language. And of course that obviously developed my whole concept of diversity and of the actual diversity of the world. And it made a big, and of course my history as well. Obviously your education does develop your philosophy, and central to my philosophy, of course, is the whole concept of respect for diversity. The realization is that difference is of the essence of humanity. There's not two people in the whole world who are the same. And when you look at conflict, no matter where it is, what's it about? It's about difference, whether it's religion, race, or nationality. And the answer to difference, as I have kept saying, is to respect it, not to fight about it, because difference is an accident of birth. Not one of us chose to be born into any particular community. Therefore, when I see a divided community like our own, I would say to people on the other side of that community, if you'd been born into the other community, would you be fighting with what is now your own community, and vice versa? In other words, the essence of unity of any community is respect for diversity. And I think that's a very important matter. And indeed, when you look at the founding fathers of the United States, what was their philosophy? It's often forgotten, but I was very aware of it. And it's written, summarized on the American cent, A pluribus unum, written large in the grave of Abraham Lincoln. From many we are one. The essence of our unity is respect for diversity. And of course, when you consider the founding fathers of the United States were driven out of other countries by poverty, by famine, by conflict, by all of those things, and they decided that those things weren't going to happen in their new land, and that was the philosophy. And of course, when you consider that, the essence of unity is respect for diversity, that's the philosophy of peace for the world. And of course, the student in me, and I learned all that as a student when I was studying, but I also think that education is central to the development of any society. Our generation was the first generation to get full education right through to university level. And that's why even to this very day, as I'm talking to you, I've been saying publicly in recent months that one of the things that we should be sending to Afghanistan is education. When you look at that poor country, 85% of its women can't read or write because women are not allowed to go to school. And 65% of the community can't read or write because they don't go to school. The only wealth that exists in this world, the only wealth that any country has is people. Without people, any country is a jungle. It's people who create. And therefore, if there is no education, their talents and creativity will not be fully developed. Education has transformed our society. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you if it wasn't for education. And before I grew up, our society was full of intelligent people who didn't get educated. And very many of them were known as street characters, and were very humorous people. And I've been asked in recent interviews, are there any street characters in your city now? And I say, no, there's not. And he says, well, where are they? I say, they're all university professors, But that's the case. Education. And I think this is a real strong message, particularly for third world countries and countries that are suffering terrible poverty and underdevelopment. That while it's right and proper to send them food and money, we should also, the best help we can give them is send them education, ensure that all of their young people and children will be fully educated, because when that happens, a country will then become self-sufficient because its own people will create its own wealth.
Law and politics go naturally together because so much of political life does revolve around law and legislation. The mental techniques that lawyers develop are particularly helpful, I think, in dealing certainly with legislation, but also I think in dealing with politics as well. And that's the ability to analyse, to cope with a considerable volume of material and to try and pick out from that what is relevant, what is not relevant. Are particularly important, and attention to detail also comes through as well. Now, my own preferred approach in terms of approaching a political situation will be not in terms of coming from sweeping broad principles or from emotional positions, but from a position of having respect for the facts that you're dealing with, looking at them closely, examining what is not possible, a less dramatic perhaps form of approach, but yet one that is absolutely essential. It doesn't mean that you don't have principles that guide you and goals that you're working towards, but it does mean that you focus on what is practicable and what is realizable, and that you have some respect for the medium with which you are working, which is other people and other particular situations, and you don't assume that you can remold humanity or change situations by dramatic gestures. So the painstaking, methodical approach of a lawyer is, I think, actually a desirable thing in life generally, and particularly in political life, where people can quite often succumb to ideological views and to the belief that it is possible easily to produce revolutionary change when in fact it's not. If it simply remains a matter of the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, pitched against the Irish Republican Army, then the rest of society will be the loser. And John's quite right in that sense. What we need to do is to change the context entirely, and that is to get away from a society that is going to be dominated by competing sectarian ghettos to a society where everybody is living by the same set of rules.
Well, I was obviously very honoured to receive the Nobel Prize. But as I said when I received it, I saw it not just as an award to myself. I saw it as a very strong statement from one of the most respected organisations in the world, the Nobel Institute, of support for our peace process and of real sympathy for the people of Northern Ireland. And in that sense, since it was awarded to both David Trimble and myself, I believe it strengthened the peace process because it showed that there was real international sympathy for our people and support for our peace process.
The Norwegian Nobel Committee did say to us when we had the opportunity of speaking to them that they liked, if the opportunity was there, to use the prize constructively to encourage developments that were taking place, that they didn't sit and wait until you had a situation where everything was settled, there were no more problems, and then the award, making an award, was drawing a line over something that's finished, that they know that they're acting in an evolving and changing situation. I'm glad that they have that tolerance, because what was in my mind when I first heard about the award was that in 1977, the Norwegian Nobel Committee had awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to two people from Northern Ireland with regard to their efforts to bring about peace, at a time when there was some hope that those efforts would succeed. But unfortunately, in the fairly short time after the award was made, that hope died. And the award was made to people who were trying hard. No reflection on them personally that it failed, but nonetheless, it did fail. In the autumn of 1998, yes, we'd got an agreement, and that was quite significant. To get an agreement was significant. But I was fully conscious of the difficulties there would be in implementing that agreement, and I knew that the agreement was not guaranteed to succeed. So my first reaction on the award was concern that history should not repeat itself. I didn't want to see 1997 repeat itself, and to find that the award is made only to find a few months later that the political effort that the award recognises collapses. And that's why I said at the time, my first published comment on it was that I hoped that the award would not prove premature. Now, in the event, I think I'm still on the right side of the line in that respect, and that we've managed to keep the process going and have made progress since then. But mind you, we can't even say that things are definitively settled and resolved at the moment. The problems created by paramilitarism, by the armed gangs that exist, by the danger that those gangs will transmute themselves into mafia-style organisations. Mafia started in Sicily as a national liberation movement. Look how it's developed since. There is a very serious danger there. We have a lot of work to do to achieve the objective that we set ourselves in the agreement of producing a society that operates by exclusively peaceful and democratic means.
As we look at our future, our big challenges are, of course, that we are working together in our common interests. Therefore, the big challenge is to make sure that the development of those common interests are successful, which means, largely speaking, real politics, the development of the economy. In other words, making sure that we give hope to our young people, that they can earn a living in the land of their birth. Because in the land that we've grown up in, many of our young people have had to leave to go to other lands to earn a living. But the more that we ensure that to happen, that will strengthen our community. And of course, it will mean that our young people from the different sections of our community will be working every day under the one roof. They will be spilling their sweat, not their blood. And that will break down the real border in Ireland, which is in the minds and hearts of people. It will break down and erode the prejudices and distrusts of the past and build a completely new friendship. And a new Ireland will evolve based on agreement and respect for difference.